They didn't split the atom. They split history in half.
The Secret That Split the Atom, December 2nd, 1942. The winter air above Chicago bit with a cruelty that only the Midwest understood, but deep beneath Stagg Field, the abandoned football stadium at the University of Chicago, the temperature was different. Not warm, exactly, but thick with tension, with the weight of something unspeakable gathering in the shadows of a squash court that had been converted into humanity's most dangerous laboratory. 49 men stood in that space, breathing recycled air, surrounded by a structure that looked like a mad architect's fever dream. It was a pile, really, just a pile of graphite bricks and uranium, stacked with obsessive precision into a shape that suggested purpose but revealed nothing to the uninitiated eye. Black dust coated everything. It settled on their clothes, their skin, worked its way into the creases of their hands and the corners of their mouths. They breathed it in with every nervous inhalation, this graphite that would become part of them, a physical reminder of what they were about to do. Outside that room, the world continued in ignorance. Students walked across campus, their minds occupied with exams and sweethearts and the war that raged across two oceans. Professors lectured in halls above, their voices droning about literature and philosophy and mathematics, unaware that beneath their feet, the fundamental nature of reality was about to be rewritten. In downtown Chicago, businessmen negotiated deals over lunch. Mothers pushed baby carriages through parks dusted with early snow. Factory workers punched time cards, producing the steel and rubber and fabric that fed the war machine. None of them knew. None of them could have imagined that in a converted squash court beneath an athletic facility, a handful of men were preparing to unlock a force that had burned in the hearts of stars since the universe began. Enrico Fermi stood at the center of it all, a slight man with dark hair and darker eyes that missed nothing. He was 31 years old and already one of the most brilliant physicists on the planet, a man who could calculate complex equations in his head while others fumbled with slide rules. He had fled fascist Italy with his Jewish wife, leaving behind everything familiar because he understood what was coming, understood that Europe was sliding toward an abyss from which it might never return. Now he stood in America, in this basement, building something that could end the war or end the world. The distinction, he knew, might prove academic. Around him, the other scientists waited. They were an extraordinary collection of minds, refugees and Americans, theorists and engineers, united by their understanding of nuclear physics and their terror of what would happen if Nazi Germany developed this technology first. Leo Szilard was there, the Hungarian physicist who had first conceived of the nuclear chain reaction while standing at a traffic light in London years earlier, a moment of inspiration that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Eugene Wigner, another Hungarian, a man of careful thought and precise speech. Herbert Anderson, Fermi's young protege, who had helped build this pile brick by brick, layer by layer, never quite believing it would actually work until this moment. Walter Zen, whose hands would manipulate the control rods, whose reflexes might be all that stood between a controlled reaction and a catastrophe. And scattered throughout the room, younger scientists, graduate students, men whose names would never appear in history books but whose presence here marked them forever, divided their lives into before and after. The pile itself was an architectural marvel of the atomic age, though no one looking at it would have used such a word. It was crude, ugly even, a roughly spherical structure made of alternating layers of graphite bricks and uranium oxide, interspersed with slugs of uranium metal. The graphite served as a moderator, slowing down the neutrons that would be released when uranium atoms split, giving those neutrons a better chance of striking other uranium atoms and causing them to split in turn. It was a carefully calibrated system, built on theoretical calculations that had never been tested at this scale. They had constructed it over weeks, each layer added with meticulous care, instruments measuring the neutron multiplication factor as the pile grew taller, watching that factor creep closer and closer to the critical point where a sustained chain reaction would become possible. They had stopped just short of that point, inserting control rods made of cadmium, a material that absorbed neutrons, preventing the reaction from starting. Now, on this December afternoon, they were going to pull those rods out and see if their calculations were correct or if they had built an atomic bomb in the middle of a major American city. The risks were staggering, though they didn't discuss them often. If the reaction went out of control, if it grew too quickly, the pile could melt down or even explode. They had calculated the dangers, run the numbers again and again, convinced themselves it was safe enough. But nuclear physics in 1942 was still half theory, half guesswork. They were pioneering territory where no human had ever ventured, and they were doing it in a squash court beneath a football stadium in the middle of Chicago. If something went wrong, if their calculations were off by even a small margin, the consequences would be catastrophic. Thousands could die. The university would be destroyed. Radioactive contamination would spread across the city like an invisible plague. They had taken precautions, of course. There were emergency procedures, safety measures. On the platform above the pile stood a liquid control squad, 3 men with buckets of cadmium solution ready to dump onto the pile if things went wrong, flooding it with neutron-absorbing material. Another man stood ready with an axe to cut a rope that would drop emergency control rods into the pile. These measures were meant to be reassuring, but everyone in the room understood they were desperate last-ditch efforts, contingencies that might not work if the reaction grew too fast. The clock on the wall read 3 o'clock. Fermi looked around the room, making eye contact with his key personnel, receiving small nods of readiness. His face betrayed nothing, the same calm expression he wore when lecturing students about theoretical physics or discussing baseball, his adopted country's sport that he had learned to love. But his mind was racing, running through the calculations one more time, checking and rechecking the numbers that told him this would work, that they could control this reaction, that they were not about to immolate themselves and a significant portion of Chicago in nuclear fire. "We are ready," Fermi said, his accent still thick despite years in America. His voice carried clearly in the confined space, cutting through the nervous silence. "We will proceed slowly, carefully. At each step, we will measure and verify before continuing. There will be no rushing, no shortcuts. We do this correctly, or we do not do it at all." The actual process began with almost anticlimactic mundanity. Fermi gave instructions in a calm, measured voice. Walter then operated the main control rod, withdrawing it gradually while instruments recorded the neutron count in the pile. With each increment, the clicking of the neutron counters increased, a stuttering percussion that served as an audible measure of the reaction's intensity. After each adjustment, Fermi would call for measurements, would consult his slide rule, would calculate the neutron multiplication factor with the practiced ease of a man who had spent thousands of hours studying these phenomena. The numbers were recorded in logbooks, data points that would be analyzed later by other scientists, verification that this was real, that this had actually happened. They worked through the afternoon in this manner, a gradual escalation that felt more like a careful experiment than a world-changing event. Pull the rod out a few inches. Measure. Calculate. Record. Pull it out a little more. Measure. Calculate. Record. The rhythm was almost soothing, a methodical process that pushed back against the enormity of what they were attempting. These were scientists, after all, men trained to trust data and observation, to let measurements guide their actions. The drama of the moment was subsumed beneath layers of procedure and protocol. But the tension never truly dissipated. It hung in the air like the graphite dust, coating everything, impossible to ignore. Every man in that room understood the significance of what was happening. They were not just conducting an experiment, they were crossing a threshold in human history. For billions of years, nuclear chain reactions had existed only in the cores of stars, in those unimaginable furnaces where temperatures and pressures crushed hydrogen into helium and released the energy that lit the cosmos. Now, here, in a basement in Chicago, men were about to recreate that stellar fire on Earth, to bring the power of the sun into human hands. The implications were staggering, terrifying, intoxicating. It meant energy without limit, power to transform civilization. It also meant weapons of unprecedented destructive capability, the power to end civilization just as easily. At 3:25 in the afternoon, Fermi made his calculations and looked up from his slide rule. The neutron multiplication factor was approaching 1, the critical point where each fission would produce, on average, 1 more fission, creating a self-sustaining chain reaction. They were close, so close. He gave the order to withdraw the control rod another foot. Walter then operated the mechanism, and the rod slid smoothly out of the pile. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then the neutron counters began to accelerate, their clicking merging into a continuous buzz that filled the room. The needles on the recording instrument swung smoothly upward, tracing curves on graph paper that showed exponential growth. The pile was alive. Neutrons were racing through the graphite and uranium, splitting atoms, releasing more neutrons, which split more atoms. A cascade of subatomic violence that generated heat and radiation and the promise of unlimited energy. Fermi watched the instruments with absolute focus, his mind processing the data, confirming that the reaction was proceeding as predicted. The multiplication factor was above 1. The reaction was self-sustaining. For the first time in human history, a controlled nuclear chain reaction was occurring outside the core of a star. They had done it. They had actually done it. The impossible had become real, rendered concrete by mathematics and engineering and the stubborn insistence of brilliant minds that the universe could be understood and manipulated. But this was not the time for celebration. Fermi let the reaction continue, watching the instruments, gathering data, verifying that their control mechanisms worked, that they could manage this power they had unleashed. 28 minutes. That was how long he allowed the reaction to run, 28 minutes of sustained nuclear fission, 28 minutes that proved beyond any doubt that a chain reaction could be controlled, could be started and stopped at will. It was a short time, really, barely half an hour, but it was enough. The data was clear. The theory was confirmed. They had bridged the gap between speculation and reality. At 3:53, Fermi gave the order to shut down the reaction. The control rods slid back into the pile, their cadmium-absorbing neutrons, breaking the chain reaction. The clicking of the counters slowed, decelerated, returned to background levels. The needles on the recording instruments traced descending curves, elegant mathematical functions that showed the reaction dying, returning to dormancy. The pile was quiet again, just a stack of graphite and uranium, inert and silent. But everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was profound, heavy with the weight of what they had accomplished and what it meant. These were men who understood the implications, who could see the future branching before them in ways that ordinary people could not. They had unlocked a new force, had given humanity the power of the stars. What would be done with that power? How would it be used? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Eugene Wigner broke the silence. He had brought a bottle of Italian wine, Chianti, a gesture that acknowledged Fermi's heritage and the magnitude of the moment. He produced the bottle now, and paper cups were distributed, the mundane artifacts of ordinary life rendered strange by the context. They poured the wine carefully, the deep red liquid looking almost black in the dim light of the squash court. Someone proposed a toast, though the words have been lost to history. They drank, the wine sharp and acidic on their tongues, a physical sensation that anchored them in the moment, reminded them that they were still human, still flesh and blood despite the cosmic forces they had manipulated. No one cheered. There was no euphoria, no backslapping, no loud celebration. The mood was somber, almost funeral. They understood, better than anyone else on Earth could possibly understand, what they had done. This was not just a scientific achievement. This was the opening of a door that could never be closed, the crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. The same reaction that had run for 28 minutes in this pile could be weaponized, scaled up, made into a bomb of unimaginable destructive power. And they knew, with a certainty that killed any possibility of joy, that it would be weaponized. The war demanded it. The military required it. The fear of Nazi Germany developing atomic weapons first overrode every other consideration. The United States government had already made its decision. The Manhattan Project, as it was codenamed, had been underway for months, a massive secret program that dwarfed everything that had come before. Billions of dollars were being spent, entire cities were being built in secret locations across the country. Tens of thousands of workers were being recruited to build the facilities and equipment necessary to produce atomic weapons. What had happened today in Chicago was just one step, an important one, but only a step. The reaction they had achieved in the pile would be replicated and scaled up in massive reactors built in Tennessee and Washington state. Producing plutonium, a new element that existed only in trace amounts in nature but could be manufactured in nuclear reactors and used to make bombs even more powerful than those based on uranium. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, vast facilities were being constructed to separate the rare isotope uranium-235 from natural uranium, a technological challenge of staggering complexity that required innovations in chemistry, physics, and engineering. And in New Mexico, in a secret laboratory hidden in the mountains, the best scientific minds in America were being assembled to design the actual weapons, to solve the enormous technical challenges of making a nuclear explosion occur reliably and efficiently. The scientists in the squash court that day understood all of this. Most of them were already involved in the Manhattan Project, had already been recruited, had already signed the security oaths that bound them to secrecy under threat of imprisonment for treason. They could not talk about what they were doing, not to their wives, not to their friends, not to anyone outside the small circle of cleared personnel. Some of them had families who didn't know where they were during the day, who had no idea that their husbands and fathers were building weapons of mass destruction. The secrecy was absolute, enforced by military intelligence officers who monitored communications, followed suspicious individuals, made it clear that any breach would result in immediate and severe consequences. And the scientists themselves were trapped, caught in a moral vice from which there was no escape. They had been recruited with appeals to patriotism, with the argument that Nazi Germany was working on atomic weapons and that America needed to develop them first or face the prospect of Hitler armed with nukes. It was a compelling argument, terrifying in its implications. Most of the physicists working on the Manhattan Project were refugees from fascism, had seen firsthand what the Nazis were capable of, had lost friends and family members to the death camps. They understood the stakes. They believed, or wanted to believe, that they were working to prevent a greater evil, that by building these weapons they were ensuring that Hitler could not use them to dominate the world. But there was a dark underside to this rationalization, and some of them were beginning to see it. What would happen after the weapons were built? What would happen after the war was over? Would these devices simply be dismantled, the knowledge locked away, the power of the atom safely contained? Or would they become permanent fixtures of military arsenals, weapons that would proliferate and spread until every major power possessed them, until the world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation? These questions gnawed at them, particularly at men like Leo Szilard, who had been one of the first to understand the possibility of nuclear weapons and who was already beginning to regret his role in bringing them into existence. The reality was that most of the scientists working on the Manhattan Project never had a real choice. Once they were approached by military intelligence, once they were read into the program, they were effectively drafted. The project was classified at the highest levels of secrecy. To refuse participation would mean facing charges of treason, particularly for the refugee scientists who could be accused of being enemy sympathizers. Their families could be threatened. Their careers would be destroyed. They were isolated, surrounded by military security, cut off from the normal channels of academic communication. They worked in secret facilities, lived in hastily constructed housing, existed in a parallel world that operated according to different rules than the civilian society around them. And many of them didn't even know what they were building until it was too late. The Manhattan Project was compartmentalized with obsessive thoroughness. Workers in Tennessee operating the uranium enrichment facilities didn't know what the uranium was for. Technicians assembling components didn't know how those components would be used. Only a small number of people at the very top understood the full scope of the project, knew that the end goal was to build atomic bombs. For many of the scientists, the realization of what they were creating came gradually, piece by piece, as they worked on their individual assignments and slowly understood how their work fit into the larger picture. By then, they were deeply involved, complicit, unable to extricate themselves without facing severe consequences. The moral weight of this situation was crushing. These were, for the most part, decent men, intellectuals who had devoted their lives to understanding the universe, who believed in the power of knowledge to improve human existence. Now they were building weapons designed to kill hundreds of thousands of people in a single instant. The cognitive dissonance was enormous, and different scientists dealt with it in different ways. Some convinced themselves that they were preventing greater evils, that the weapons would end the war quickly and save lives in the long run. Some retreated into the technical challenges, focusing on the fascinating physics and engineering problems while trying not to think about the ultimate purpose of their work. Some drank heavily, numbing themselves to the moral implications. And some, like Leo Szilard, began to question everything, began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake, if the cure they were creating might be worse than the disease. As 1942 turned into 1943, as 1943 turned into 1944, the Manhattan Project accelerated. The reactors in Tennessee and Washington came online, producing plutonium. The enrichment facilities in Tennessee began separating uranium-235. At Los Alamos, the secret laboratory in New Mexico, scientists under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer worked feverishly to design workable bomb configurations. They faced enormous challenges. A nuclear weapon required bringing subcritical masses of fissile material together fast enough that a chain reaction could occur before the material blew itself apart. The physics was extraordinarily difficult, requiring innovations in explosives, metallurgy, and nuclear physics. They worked around the clock, driven by the fear that Germany would develop a bomb first, driven by the momentum of the project itself, which had taken on a life of its own, which could not be stopped even if they wanted to stop it. And then, in May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, his regime destroyed, his country in ruins. And the Manhattan Project scientists learned that Germany had never come close to building an atomic bomb. The German nuclear program had been poorly funded, poorly organized, never a serious threat. The justification for the American program, the fear that drove them, the nightmare scenario that had motivated so many of them, had been largely illusory. The Nazis had never been about to develop atomic weapons. There had been no race, or if there had been a race, America had been running alone, against an opponent who wasn't even on the track. This revelation was devastating for many of the scientists. The moral calculus that had justified their work suddenly collapsed. They had built these weapons to prevent Hitler from using them, but Hitler had never had them, had never been close to having them. So why were they still building bombs? Why was the project continuing? The answer, of course, was that the momentum was too great to stop, and the target had changed. Japan was still fighting, still resisting, and the military wanted to use the atomic bomb to force a Japanese surrender, to avoid the need for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Some scientists, particularly Leo Szilard, tried to stop it. They drafted petitions, wrote letters to government officials, argued that the bomb should not be used, or that if it must be used, it should be demonstrated on an uninhabited island to show the Japanese its power without killing civilians. These efforts went nowhere. The military and political leadership had already decided. The bomb would be used against Japanese cities as soon as it was ready, without warning. The scientists' opinions were noted and ignored. They had built the weapon, but they had no control over how it would be deployed. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was tested. The explosion was beyond anything they had imagined, a flash of light brighter than the sun, a fireball that rose into the sky and formed a mushroom cloud that would become the iconic symbol of the nuclear age. The shockwave rattled buildings miles away. The heat was so intense that it turned the desert sand into glass. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the test, thought of a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The scientists who had worked on the bomb stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the fruits of their labor, and felt the full weight of what they had created. 3 weeks later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, used uranium-235 and had an explosive yield equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT. It detonated 1,900 feet above the city at 8:15 a.m. local time. The fireball was visible for miles, a sun that appeared suddenly in the morning sky. The blast wave leveled everything within a mile of the detonation point, crushing buildings, incinerating people, creating a firestorm that consumed the city. The thermal radiation was so intense that it vaporized people close to the hypocenter, leaving only shadows burned into concrete and stone. Those farther away were burned horribly, their skin hanging in strips, their bodies radiating heat. The prompt radiation dose killed thousands instantly. Many more would die in the hours, days, and weeks that followed from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. The official death toll from Hiroshima is estimated at 70,000 people killed immediately, with the total rising to about 140,000 by the end of 1945 when deaths from radiation and injuries were counted. But the true number will never be known with certainty. Entire families were vaporized, leaving no one to report them missing. Records were destroyed. The city itself was largely obliterated. What had been a thriving urban center of 350,000 people was reduced to ruins and ashes in a fraction of a second. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. This bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, used plutonium produced in the reactors whose design had been proven in that squash court beneath Stagg Field. The Nagasaki bomb had a yield of about 21,000 tons of TNT, more powerful than the Hiroshima weapon. It killed approximately 40,000 people immediately, with the total rising to about 70,000 by the end of the year. Nagasaki was spared some of the devastation of Hiroshima by its hilly terrain, which channeled and contained the blast, but entire neighborhoods were still vaporized, and the city was left in ruins. 6 days after Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. The war was over. The atomic bomb had worked exactly as intended, had demonstrated such overwhelming destructive power that continued resistance seemed futile. The military leadership was satisfied. The bombs had ended the war without the need for an invasion, had saved American lives, had proven the value of the Manhattan Project. It was a clean narrative, a success story that could be told without moral ambiguity. But for the scientists who had built the bombs, the story was not clean at all. They had created weapons that killed over 200,000 people in 2 attacks, weapons that caused suffering on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, bore witness to horrors that defied description. They told stories of people walking through rubble with their arms held out in front of them, the skin hanging from their bodies like melted wax. They described the smell of burning flesh that permeated the cities for days. They spoke of the black rain that fell after the explosions, rain contaminated with radioactive fallout that poisoned those it touched. They talked about the strange disease that appeared in the weeks after the bombings, radiation sickness that caused people's hair to fall out, their gums to bleed, their organs to fail. Many of the survivors would carry the effects for the rest of their lives, suffering from cancers and other diseases caused by radiation exposure, marked forever by the weapons that the scientists had built. The scientists themselves were shattered. Some, like Oppenheimer, tried to process their guilt through public service, advocating for international control of atomic energy, arguing against the development of even more powerful hydrogen bombs. Others, like Leo Szilard, left weapons work entirely, devoting themselves to biology and other fields, trying to do something constructive to balance the destruction they had enabled. Still others drank themselves into early graves, unable to live with what they had done. They met at conferences and reunions, and their conversations would turn, inevitably, to the question that haunted them: had it been necessary? Had the bombs really saved lives, or had they simply demonstrated American power and opened a Pandora's box that could never be closed? The official narrative said yes, the bombs were necessary, they had ended the war quickly and saved American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. But historical research in the decades that followed complicated this story. Japan was already on the verge of surrender. The Soviet Union had just entered the war against Japan, which was perhaps more significant than the atomic bombs in forcing Japanese capitulation. Some historians have argued that Japan would have surrendered within weeks even without the bombs, that the decision to use them was motivated more by a desire to intimidate the Soviet Union and justify the enormous expense of the Manhattan Project than by military necessity. The truth is complex, probably unknowable with certainty, and it depends on assumptions and counterfactuals that can never be definitively proven. What is certain is that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the world fundamentally. They demonstrated that humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself, that weapons existed which could, if used in sufficient numbers, end civilization or even render the planet uninhabitable. This realization shaped the entire post-war era. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was defined by nuclear weapons, by the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, by the constant terror that a mistake or miscalculation could trigger a nuclear exchange that would kill hundreds of millions of people. Both superpowers built enormous nuclear arsenals, tens of thousands of warheads, delivery systems that could strike any point on the globe within minutes. The world lived under a nuclear shadow. Children grew up with the knowledge that they could be vaporized at any moment. People built fallout shelters and practiced duck-and-cover drills that everyone knew were futile gestures against weapons of such power. The nuclear arms race consumed trillions of dollars, money that could have fed the hungry, housed the homeless, cured diseases, explored the cosmos. Instead, it went to building weapons that could never be used without inviting mutual annihilation. The logic was perverse but inescapable. Nuclear weapons were so powerful that they could not be used, which meant they existed only as deterrents, as threats, as symbols of power. And so the bombs multiplied, warheads piled on warheads, delivery systems grew more sophisticated, and the world became more dangerous even as the weapons themselves made direct confrontation between superpowers less likely. And what of the scientists, the men who had started it all, who had gathered in that squash court beneath Stag Field and brought the power of the stars to Earth? Many of them spent the rest of their lives grappling with their legacy. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, tried to explain why they had done what they had done. They warned about the dangers of nuclear weapons, advocated for disarmament, argued for international cooperation. But they could not undo what they had done. The knowledge existed. The weapons existed. The world had been changed, and there was no changing it back. Enrico Fermi died in 1954, at age 53, of stomach cancer. Whether the cancer was caused by his exposure to radiation during his work on the Manhattan Project is unknown and probably unknowable. J. Robert Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance in 1954 in a politically motivated hearing that destroyed his reputation, payback for his opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his left-wing associations. He died in 1967, a broken man. Leo Szilard devoted his later years to molecular biology and peace activism, trying to prevent the nuclear war he had helped make possible. He died in 1964. Eugene Wigner continued working in nuclear physics and received the Nobel Prize in 1963. He died in 1995, one of the last survivors of that December day in Chicago. The pile itself, the graphite structure that had hosted the first controlled nuclear chain reaction, was dismantled shortly after the experiment. The materials were reused in other projects. The squash court was eventually demolished. A plaque marks the spot now, a small memorial to an event that changed everything. Tourists visit, take pictures, move on. The University of Chicago has a sculpture commemorating the achievement, a massive bronze piece that captures something of the power and terror of what happened there. But it is hard, standing in that place on a modern day, to truly grasp the significance, to understand that here, in this ordinary spot, history split in two. Because that is what happened on December 2nd, 1942. It was not just a scientific experiment. It was not just the first step toward ending World War II. It was the moment when humanity gained the power to destroy itself completely, the moment when we became, in a very real sense, our own greatest threat. Before that day, wars could kill millions, could devastate nations, could reshape the map of the world. But they could not end civilization. They could not make the earth uninhabitable. After that day, after that 28-minute chain reaction and a pile of graphite and uranium, that power existed. We had become as gods, with the ability to create and destroy on a cosmic scale, but we had not gained the wisdom that such power required. The scientists who built the bomb understood this better than anyone. They had split the atom, but in doing so, they had split history in half. There was the world before nuclear weapons, a world where wars had limits, where human destructive capability was constrained by logistics and resources. And there was the world after, the world we still inhabit, where a handful of people with briefcases and launch codes can end civilization in an afternoon, where weapons exist in bunkers and submarines that could kill billions of people, where the survival of the human race depends on the rationality and restraint of political leaders who are often neither rational nor restrained. It is a terrible legacy, born in a squash court beneath a football stadium, brought into being by brilliant men who thought they were preventing a greater evil and who spent the rest of their lives wondering if they had instead created one. They drank wine from paper cups and felt the weight of what they had done, and that weight never lifted, not for any of them, not for the rest of their lives. They had opened a door that could not be closed, had released a force that could not be contained, had given humanity the power of the stars without any assurance that humanity was ready for such power. And so we live in the world they made, under the shadow of the weapons they built, hoping that the deterrent holds, that rationality prevails, that the bombs remain in their bunkers and never fall. We live with the knowledge that in squash courts and laboratories and secret facilities, human ingenuity unlocked a power that might yet destroy us all. We live with the legacy of December 2nd, 1942, the day the atom was split, the day history was split, the day everything changed and could never change back.